It's really a great pleasure and an honor for me to introduce our guest and to have this conversation. Dr. Rahul Gupta is the head of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, most known in town by acronyms. Everybody knows things by acronyms. Down here is ONDCP. But he comes to this position, which is an enormously important position in the U.S. government, after an extraordinary career of service, both as an academic, which we very much appreciate, and as a government official and working with the civil society sector. He came to this position after serving as the Chief Medical and Health Officer at the March of Dimes, a really important and tremendous organization where he really led the strategic oversight for the organization. But he also served as a clinical professor at Georgetown University Medical School, just down the street, and not only in the medical school, but also in the Department of Health Policy. So he also has a distinguished career as a practitioner serving the underserved. And I know that in that experience, you probably saw firsthand the kind of the human impact of the challenges that you're facing in your current role. And you come to this position, obviously at a very challenging time. We've all read and seen, many people have seen in their own communities, the extraordinary impact of the opioid crisis that really has just had a profound impact on our society here. But it's also has profound implications for the U.S. engagement with other countries around the world. And I know that we're both conscious of the human costs here, but we're really especially interested in hearing your perspective on this dimension about the security and economic dimensions of trying to deal with this new challenge. Drugs have been a long-time challenge for us, but it's taken on such a new dimension. And so it's particularly nice for us to here at SAIS to have you talk to us about the economic and security implications of the current crisis and the strategy that the Biden administration is pursuing. So let me just ask you to begin by giving us your overview and your perspective on this, and then we'll drill down on some of the more specific issues as we go forward.
Great. Thank you, Dean Steinberg, and really appreciate it for that introduction, as well as your service to the nation, as well as here at SAIS, and obviously the academic work that you have done, as well as the authorship of so many other texts and other works that we're just happy to have, and sets up the future policy students, but also public servants. Thank you very much for that. It's really great to be with everyone here. What I want to do is a little bit talk about, as the Dean mentioned, about this challenge, what it is and what it means. When I've been practicing for about 25 years, both large cities as large as 25 million people, and small towns where, people have paid me with homegrown apple pies and homegrown tomatoes. So I've seen that in very rural areas. I've seen it in larger areas, but I've also seen it in my practice. I've gone shifts where I had to reverse an overdose every single shift for months at a time. I've had people who have been treated successfully. I've also had people who have unfortunately succumbed to their disease. I've attended a lot of funerals, unfortunately and sadly, and that's just been the reality of this particular crisis. So when the president asked me to serve in this role, not only was I honored, but I was eager, because there's an ability and opportunity for us to do something about this in a real way. Just really quickly about the office, we have, it's an office in a component of the White House. We have the budget oversight, about 18 federal agencies, $40 billion. We work with both the public health side, HHS components and others, but also the national security side, like Department of Defense, state, as well as Homeland Security, DEA, Justice, and others. So working at the intersection of public health and safety has been important. Obviously, the time when we've had over 108,000 Americans die, that's an American dying every 5 minutes around the clock. But I want you to think about that only as a tip of the iceberg. Next to it is about 1 million people in this country each year who suffer from non-fatal overdoses. And underneath that is roughly about 36 million Americans who suffer from substance use disorder. So this is a large swath of the society, and there's about 23 million people in recovery today, 60% of whom are working, gainfully employed in this country. So when we're talking about a really important piece, and this is why one of the reasons is that President Biden made this a part of his unity agenda earlier this year in his State of the Union speech, because he sees this as an important part, important challenge that doesn't care about people's politics or whether you're black or white, rural, urban, rich or poor. It pervades all of us everywhere. So I want to talk a little bit about, what does that present strategy means? The one, our office is responsible for not only proposing and sending to Congress the president's drug control strategy, but also holding it and making sure it works through the arm of the Budget Control Authority over the agencies and the budget. We looked at two areas: untreated addiction and the lack of an infrastructure for treatment, and the drug trafficking profits and what drives that problem to begin with. So I want to talk about the other one, this supply side, today a little bit, and we're happy to talk about it. As I've looked at this, the problem has evolved, the environment has evolved over time, and it has really grown in a way that few understand it very well today. Let me talk about why that's a big deal. We have now started to see a very important shift from what we've seen for decades, organic or plant-based drugs, to synthetics, like fentanyl. And as with synthetics, the shift has happened. A Pandora's box has been opened, because now you can have more lethal, smaller amounts of drugs that are pervading the drug supply across the country and perhaps across the world. And it's become really dangerous at this point. And it often happens where people don't have the treatments available, they don't have the substance use prevention, harm reduction, recovery support, all those services that you need to help people. That doesn't exist, but the lethal supply happens. And that's a challenge between supply and demand. Now, we know that the COVID has clearly exacerbated the crisis, especially in the last 2.5 years or so. We've in fact seen a significant increase in the amount of deaths. But it's also fundamental changes that are occurring to implications of as well the America's security, national security, as well as our prosperity. And I want to talk about that a little bit, why this is important, not just from a public health perspective, which is really critical, but also from a national security perspective, global security perspective, as well as opportunity and prosperity. Now, when we address this, we have to address one simple truth, that there's a complex interplay between availability of drugs, their toxicity, and their use. Why is that important? Because traffickers are not going to import drugs that nobody wants. And individuals cannot overdose on drugs that are not easily available to them for use. These things are important because this is why disrupting the flow of drugs into the United States is just as important. And it's important also to prevent it from harming our citizens, because if it remains easier to get lethal illicit drugs than it is to get treatment, we're never going to be able to address the crisis. So I want to mention 3 domains that will give you an idea of the challenges we face, and then what are those challenges and what are we going to do about it. That's the kind of the way I want to talk about this. How we got here, everybody knows about the opioid prescribing, the legal opioid prescribing, all the way from about early 2000s. And what had happened was, clearly as that was happening, and I saw myself, my patients, my colleagues' patients, as we started to clamp down on the prescribing, people were moving to the street alternative that was easily available, cheaper, and often used injectable drugs. Now, that's when the first transformation started to happen about 7 years ago, which is we began to see that instead of the producers and traffickers, normally they would score poppy or grow, harvest cocoa or mixed precursor chemicals. That was traditional. But now we started to see a lot more fentanyl start to mix up in the supply of these drugs. Lethal. Why is fentanyl more important? than just heroin because heroin is about 4 times more potent than morphine. Fentanyl is up to 100 times more potent than morphine. So it's very lethal and very dangerous. And the impact was devastating. Just from 2015 to 16, the fentanyl deaths doubled in this country, doubled in 1 year, 100% increase. And at the same time, the same year, the heroin deaths has the slowest rise in decades. So heroin's rise wasn't at all important in that sense, and fentanyl caused doubling in deaths. Now, this was an important piece because what we started to see here was the traction to fentanyl. It was being also transformed into pills and other forms, and there was a huge proliferation of the fentanyl analogs, other types of molecules very similar to fentanyl that could be used for either effect or escaping detection by law enforcement. So that was one of the things. And what happened was we quickly controlled that particular substance of fentanyl. But by the time the regulatory scheme began to and finished controlling, there came another substance. So it was like a game of whack-a-mole that we continued to play while people were dying. And where this was coming was predominantly at the time from China. So most of the completed fentanyl was being imported from China at the time. Now that's where the second component comes in, the second domain here, the transaction. So about 7 years ago till today, the face of transactions of money has changed. Now, you typically for decades have thought about face-to-face cash transactions on the street, a drug dealer, a drug trafficker, and individuals. Well, that changed because of all of this. What we began to see was advertisements on dark web, hundreds of online websites where you have an inventory to go through your products, and you could pick what you want. So what happens is now you're being paid with cryptocurrency. We're shipping directly from the supplier to the buyer in mail. So we started to see the democratization of the drug trade, basically. So businesses directly could get orders from consumers, and it would come to their doorsteps with literally 3 mouse clicks. As simple as you order something on Amazon, you can order on the dark web. Now, this was when gig economy meets Amazon, if you think about it. So it brought new dimension to the illicit drug trade environment, to the point where today the ability to find these illicit drugs is literally in the palm of your hand. And all you have to do is open your social media app and you can get it. Very different environment. Now, that doesn't mean that the original method didn't stop or it didn't continue. It has continued. But this has created new problems and complicated the old problems. Now, this new dimension, the 21st century drug trafficking that happens today, is only asked to the third and final domain that I want to mention here. Now, here's why that's important. How these drugs are being used. That's important. Now, let me tell you, the transnational criminal organizations, they very well understand the pill nation that we are. We might not, but they do very well. I'll give you some instances. 53% of Americans between 18 and 34 years of age, many of you right here, use prescription drugs. Now, for those over 65, the average number of prescription is between 20 and 22. 20 and 22 prescriptions per person in the United States for folks over 65. And this in addition to over-the-counter drugs, herbals that have just mushroomed over the last few years. So if you think about it, we may not get that, but the transnational criminal organizations get it. They understand it. They understand the strong preference that Americans have for pill form of drugs. And this makes solid sense for them. Because for traffickers, not only are the pills easier to account for and move, but they allow an expansion of the customer base. Now they can get to you. Because oftentimes, people believe that they're buying a cut-rate prescription drug. People believe that they have no idea that these are drugs coming from precursors made in China and these pills made in Mexico. So we're seeing a increase and resurgence of pills for often unsuspecting people, unwitting people, and they're often mixed with fentanyl and are fatal. Now, we've also seen a drastic increase in polydrug use. Polydrug means it used to be a time when you either took depressants like heroin or stimulants like cocaine or meth. And you would pass through a cocaine dealer to buy heroin from someone else. That's not the case anymore. Today, if you got $30, you'll go to the first person and buy it. Why is that important? And it doesn't matter because drugs have everything. That's important because if we can shut down the meth trafficker, it will have limited consequence on the trade because something else will continue. And so people have become used to polydrug that only sustains and continues the drug trade. So when these three things, if you combine them together, that's what the strategic environment, drug supply environment is of today. And back in 2019, we began working with the People's Republic of China, and they actually controlled fentanyl, understanding the challenge was becoming in the United States in May of 2019. And what happened after that? The supply of completed fentanyl to the United States from China dropped to nearly zero by end of 2019. So it worked. But with that small tactical benefit caused a strategic shift. And that's really what the challenge of drug policy is. It caused a strategic shift. What was that shift? Now, Chinese criminals began to supply precursor chemicals to drug traffickers and producers in Mexico at the same time. So what happened was the production of fentanyl just shifted from China to Mexico, and then through our borders and to the United States. So, we're working right now. That's why I was disappointed when Beijing decided after Speaker Pelosi's visit to stop all the conversations and progress that was being worked on with the United States. And we believe it was a pretext to step back from the cooperation. I have a really close relationship with one of the alumnus from here, Ambassador Nick Burns, and we are working hard to bring PRC back to the table to be able to have those conversations to ensure that that this type of behavior is unacceptable for a global power, and it's really important that they not suspend their cooperation with us because American lives are at risk. But what has happened is that these criminals that are continuing to produce precursors or from precursors the actual fentanyl in Mexico, it's even more dangerous in some ways because the cartels in Mexico enjoy some of the benefits that the criminals in China did not. What that means is that they can easily corrupt and intimidate government officials, security forces there, and port workers to ensure that their continued supply of precursors happens and to continue to operate their facilities and production throughout the country with pure impunity. And they have a vast and efficient distribution network that continues to carry drugs across our southern border and through the United States to the retail level. And this shift has also actually boosted some of these Mexican drug cartels, which, if you think about it, what does a cartel want to do? Very few basic things here. We have to understand what they want. They want to reduce their production cost, right? They want to reduce the risk of production sites being seized by government. They don't want to be interdicted, their products to be interdicted. They want to increase the size of their customer base. And ultimately, they want to increase their profits. And that's exactly where fentanyl comes in. Fentanyl checks all those boxes like no other drug has before. So if you understand traffickers and producers and manufacturers, and you understand that's exactly why it makes sense why they're doing what they're doing. Now, fentanyl is remarkably efficient, as I mentioned. It's remarkably deadly. And we have to understand the complexity, but also the dynamism that goes behind it. So I want to talk a little bit about why the national security aspect is really important. Today we live in a global economy. We know that we can seamlessly have trade, flow of people, money, and in a globalized world, and it's easy to do so. But with it comes the risks that I'm mentioning. Now, let me talk about, we know that what tends to happen that these drug traffickers are often free riders. They're free riders on the back of the global commercial network and banking systems, and they exploit it to sustain and enhance their sort of efforts. We also know that there are certain forces of chaos that help supplant them. So every time that the PRC works to expand westward, some of these criminal enterprises become free riders on that train, figuratively speaking. We also know that when this is happening, the proceeds, hundreds of billions of dollars, go back to destabilize the fragile democracies in Latin America. They cause increased corruption, crime, and violence that often become reasons for migration from those host nations. So that's where the interconnection between the two happens. And basically what happens is they're also a reliable sources, the funding is, for violent extremism, terrorism, and a host of other transnational criminal endeavors. So the funding that goes through works on different places for different threats at the same time. The second piece I want to mention is the economic prosperity aspect, why that's important. There's a microenvironment of the drug user, the microeconomic impacts of their life, as well as the effects to the person. Now, we know the report, there will be a report coming out from Congress just today that will show that in 2020, this country lost $1.5 trillion because of the opioid crisis. Now, that's the equal to the GDP of Russia, 11th largest economy of the world. Think about that. That's the amount of money that we're losing per year. And I believe they're going to say that it will only go up. Now, that's a challenge, the amount of economy and the loss that is happening. But also, the people that are dying majority from this are between 25 and 54 years of age. These are the people that should be raising their families. They should be able to contribute most to their communities and the economy of the nation. And we're losing them. Now, at the same time, the fertility rate in the United States has dropped to its lowest level on record, and about half of what was in early 1960s. So the confluence of these two factors, that the youngest of the most able-bodied people dying and the lowest fertility rate, has tremendous impact, both for the short term and the long term. I'll give you an example. We know that the deaths have risen past 12 months by about 30% from this epidemic. And the fertility rate has declined by 4% at the same time. So it's the confluence of both those factors that makes it really difficult. And if you add that, this is in addition to all the deaths, a quarter of all the deaths from COVID that happen are in people below 64 years of age. So if you look at the long perspective of this is going to be a real threat to America and our both economy as well as prosperity. The National Economy, the NBER study actually showed recently that compared to pre-pandemic levels, up to 26% of the labor force participation loss was due to substance use disorder. So you're looking at significant impact of not just the population, but also the percentage of labor force participation loss and the amount of money. So this is where I think we're going to need to have global leadership of the United States stand up, because this trafficking production is being exported to other countries as we speak. Other nations, because of all the factors I mentioned, are host for this. So those who are suffering from this, as well as those who are at the risk of suffering, is one that we're going to have to demonstrate our leadership. We'll talk about the border a little bit, but it's really important to understand that the smuggling of these drugs has become a lot more dangerous and easier, both subterranean, overseas, and over the air, as well as on land. But 3 out of 4 people who die today in the United States are dying because of opioids like fentanyl. What that also means is a failure of the system because we have antidotes available, and if people had those antidotes available, we would be saving tens of thousands of lives. And that becomes important that drugs like naloxone or Narcan, for every dollar invested, there's $2,800 in return for drugs like naloxone. And that's one of the challenges we're working on, the administration is working on, is to figure out how to, at the same time, get people, less than 1 out of 10 people that needs treatment today in the United States gets treatment. So how do we get to a point where the president's strategy calls for universal access to treatment by 2025, 100%, get people the help they need right now while working to disrupt and dismantle the trade. So one of the things we're trying to do is go after it through a process of commercial disruption. We're looking at this very much like a trade as opposed to the past efforts, because past efforts have been focused on various elements and we've made some incremental progress. But I think we have to look at this as a profit-bearing trade and work on to disrupt this trade. It is not the ideology, but profits that drive these folks. Now, we are not condemned to seeing over 100,000 deaths each year. The world is not condemned to seeing this on their borders and having more people be subject to death and destruction. There's things we can do. One of those is to make sure that we're going after the right targets, which is looking at the commerce, looking at the supply chain, precursor chemicals, the dye molds and the pill presser machines that cause these pills to be made. These actors function above ground in these terms from legitimate but unsuspecting businesses. It's our job to find those businesses, make them aware, and for the illicit actors to make sure that we're holding them accountable, and use the host partner nations to work as allies with us. That's the ultimate bottom lines. And we have to work on social media platforms, e-commerce sites, as well as other both fiat as well as cryptocurrency aspects to sort of suck the energy and the money out of the system. So even the operating capital is being denied to these folks. And I think that's where it's important. I led the first post-inauguration trip to meet with President Petro in Colombia just last month. And we discussed why key partners like Colombia, which we have 200 years of relationship with, it's important for us to work congruently towards the problem. Similarly, we're working with Mexico and India and both Canada as well as China to figure out these ways to move forward. So I think when we look at this, we have to look at this from a perspective of a global challenge, a global security challenge, but also national security challenge, as well as one that has an economic and national security aspect in addition to the public health side of this. This really moment requires the United States and its partners around the world to see into the future and really begin to address both the licit and illicit trade and address and attack the trafficking enterprise. With that, I'm happy to have a conversation. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you for that. It's an extraordinary, comprehensive, and really insightful description of the challenges that we face, and so many different parts I know that both I and our audience would like to hear a little bit more about. Let me start with the China piece, if I could. So the story you tell is an interesting one. I mean, it's a story of quite remarkable success initially, as you say, in 2019, in persuading the Chinese government to cooperate in the blocking the sale and the export of completed fentanyl. And now we have this problem with the precursors. And we put aside the disruption related to the Pelosi visit. We all understand the fact that right now, given broader U.S.-China relations, almost everything has been disrupted. So this wasn't singled out in any sense. I mean, we're not talking about climate. We're not talking about anything. But reflect a little bit about it on how we were able to persuade the Chinese to stop the sale of the full pill, and what the prospects are for getting them now to cooperate on the precursor problem.
I think there's sometimes a confluence between the criminal actors within a host nation as well as their governments. And I think it's really important for us to, unless there's evidence, to be able to point out first that countries will have criminal elements in them and be able to first delineate that difference and be able to work with the host governments. And I think that's one of the first successes in relationship with China was that we reached common ground, which is, China's had a sort of interesting history of drug use in the past.
To put it mildly, yes.
Yeah. So they're very sensitive to this. And there's also, they're sensitive to their population being impacted by this. So it's important that we when we converse, we have discussion, we talk about those elements, that this is one that affects Americans, affects other peoples, but it's important to control. If you just think about the illicit actors within China, that's tax revenue, that's economy that's being taken away from the Chinese people themselves. So it becomes important that we have conversation about what does good governance require. So when we were able to have success, I think part of it was approaching it from that perspective, from a bilateral perspective, looking at it and seeing where are things that you can do as a nation to make sure that those things are help us. Now, right now, one of the things that we have been working on, we've had very specific and clear asks of the PRC. We said, one, we want you to label all of these oftentimes dual-use chemicals when they're being shipped. So the end user and everybody else knows what's coming into their countries, whether it's us, it's Mexico, or other countries. Second, we've said, we want you to have a know your customer kind of approach, KYC. So when you're sending it, your folks in your businesses should know who they're sending it to, who's the end user, and what for what purpose. So if a particular precursor has had a 500% increase in demand in Mexico, maybe it's a time to look into it, see what's going on. And the third piece is just having an idea of what is their total volume of stuff being shipped from in terms of precursor. Oftentimes it would be illicit actors. Oftentimes it can be licit actors that may have a company from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., but something else could be happening from 5 p.m. to 9 a.m. So these asks to sort of go to the shipping routes, harmonizing policies that the entire world has agreed upon are not too much to ask for. It doesn't require even a law changes. It's just a matter of regulatory changes. These are the kind of simple things that we're asking now that can make a tremendous difference in the shipping of the precursors, which will be denied, then will ultimately have an impact on production of these deadly chemicals.
And is it your sense, again, putting aside the broader geopolitical context, that the Chinese are receptive to dealing with this, or is this something that's, for them, a bridge too far?
So the interesting part about this is in a very tumultuous relationship often and competition of great powers that we're engaged in. Interestingly, counter-narcotics is often an issue and a topic that we find ourselves agreeing upon and being able to work together on. So in a world where folks don't agree on a lot of things, this is one area that we have found common agreement with the PRC in the past, and this is exactly the reason. The other part is also this is important, which is to be a global leader, you have to be committed to something, meaning that you can't bow out every time some small thing happens. So we're also trying to nudge the PRC into becoming a true global leader and being a responsive global leader to the interest of world beyond their borders as well.
Right. So let's turn maybe now to Mexico for a minute. You and I were talking about this upstairs. This has obviously been a challenging feature of the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and Mexico for a long time. I wonder if you could describe, but there have been two changes that maybe you could reflect on. One is as it happens every 7 years, we have a new government, a new president in Mexico. And second, the changes in the nature of the drugs, moving away from the plant-based, the marijuana, the cocaine, to the synthetic drugs. How has that changed the dialogue between the United States and Mexico, and how are we doing now in terms of engaging with President Lopez Obrador's government in terms of addressing this new phenomenon that you've described for us?
Well, thank you. First of all, this is public, so I'll say that, just as a setter, Mexico's economy, GDP, is about $1 trillion a year. And about 30%, about 300 billion is the GDP of the cartels, roughly estimate. So you can imagine, I say all these figures to give you an idea when a third of your country's GDP is the cartel's GDP, you don't get to have a lot of say unless you want to or you're focused on it. This is one of the areas we've been working with President Lopez Obrador closely. In the last meeting President Biden had with him, the issue of counter-narcotics, especially fentanyl, was brought up. It was discussed. We had a team down to create a task force of fentanyl. It's in the readout as well, and it's highlighted. As you all know, I don't have to tell you, when issues get discussed at the level of the presidents, they filter down and they're acted upon. So we're hopeful that some of these things, as they are being addressed and talked about, that we will continue to have more action on it. Of course, you may have heard the news that RCQ, or Quintero, was captured. Also, was famously responsible for killing of a DEA agent, Kiki Camarena, in 1985. We're working on the extradition of that individual and some others because, in December of December 15th of last year, President Biden signed 2 executive orders. One was to create a Council of Transnational Organized Crime, or CTOC. The other was to expand the sanctions ability beyond traffickers. What would happen typically is, if you take out the head, the aunt or the uncle or the wife or whoever takes over the trade. And now that executive order allows us to provide sanctions on not just the individuals, but their enablers, their real estate agents, their lawyers, their financiers, and others. It has allowed us to do more. We've had about 27 entities and 17 individuals, and each tranche of those sanctions that have come out have had the 2 cartels individuals involved, as well as those enablers of fentanyl production. So we're continuing to work. Mexico has had a very clear request to have us address the gun trafficking going south. We're very cognizant and mutually respectful also of working on that as well. And but we're also always hopeful that they would continue or want to match the enthusiasm that we have to help them to reciprocate that. However, it's always a work in progress.
Thank you for that. Let me ask one more, and then I'll turn to all of you, so get your questions ready. For a long time, as you suggested, part of the strategy in dealing with illicit drug trafficking was to follow the money, right? That was the kind of one of the tools that we had if you couldn't follow the product. But you've raised now the challenge that the dark web and crypto has made. Many of the institutions that we built around this for money to deal with money laundering and the like, presumably we've lost some of that leverage that FATF and these other organizations focused on traditional money laundering instead. So how are you thinking about dealing with this new form of transaction that doesn't go through banks, doesn't have the intermediaries? What are the tools that are available? What's the strategy to deal with this new aspect of finance?
That's a great question. So one of the things we're doing right now is to look at this as a commercial enterprise, and I mentioned commercial disruption. The idea is to map out every aspect of the drug trafficking. That starts with precursors to entire production, transport, and retail. And then go after each of those choke points, as I call them, and see the impact of that. Obviously, going after the money laundering and cryptocurrency is piece of that. A lot of the work happens in plain sight, but some of the work also happens on the dark web and on these sites. You know, we've got to remember there are vulnerabilities also that are to be exploited in the trafficking trade as well. When crypto can be worked on anonymously and gained, but it can also fluctuate very quickly. So, and we see a lot of emphasis still, that's why probably on cash. So cash is still alive and well. So for each one of these, we look at the particular vulnerabilities that exist in the trade, and we try to go after those vulnerabilities, whether it's cyber, whether it's crypto, or it's just fiat currency. But each one of these have their own unique sort of weak points as well. And our job is to make sure that there's unity of effort in government to go after these weak points. And that's one of the things that we're focused on, because we can have various agencies and efforts and actions happen, but not be coordinated. And that just makes it less effective. So one of the focuses for us is right now is to have a unity of effort of the government. So we know that when we're going after a particular entity, that whether it's for sanctions or it's for prosecutions or it's just to disrupt, which category is it? And the entire might of the U.S. government is after that.
Great. So let me turn to you in the audience for questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. So I've noticed in recent weeks, there's been some press around a small advocacy push to label fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction. It's unclear to me the benefit to that, and it seems like a relatively small advocacy effort, but I was curious if that's something seriously being considered by the White House or not.
Thank you. So that's a question. Usually the question comes in two parts. One is the fentanyl WMD. The other is traffickers as terrorists. And they're kind of the two same cloth. So what we look at this is, first, would it provide us any extra capabilities, resources, and efforts and authorities that we don't already have if we were to do that? And the answer is no. And we're applying. So what we're doing right now is, in so many ways, following the pattern of counterproliferation and looking at it from that perspective. And all of the tools that we would have in the toolbox as a WMD is exactly what we're doing already, and perhaps some more. And that's the reason for that. Same thing goes with the aspect of the terrorism aspect of that. I think it's important to recognize that when we're going after these folks in a civil society with rule of law and taking the prosecutorial aspect to the fullest extent, it's important to dismantle and disrupt the networks rather than to change the labels. And that's the important piece, is we're really focused on ensuring, and frankly, from day one, the administration has been focused on disrupting the trafficking, but also supply. To give you an example, in 21, we interdicted at the border drugs twice the amount in 2020 and 4 times the amount in 2019. And that goes back to the excellent work of our men and women, the Customs Border Protection. And that's why the president has now asked for significant increased funding for Customs Border Protection, for DEA. When I go down, and I have been to the border, I've crawled into the tunnels, actually, the drug trafficking tunnels. I've flown over where the drones would often come and deliver drugs, and seen all of the other aspects also of doing that. So the reason that the adversaries are so committed is because of profits. And I think what we should be working is to attack and disrupt the profit network, basically, rather than changing names. So that's kind of where it becomes important. But when we seize drugs, there's also 2 benefits that happen. A, those drugs don't come in and kill Americans into the United States. And B, the profits from those proceeds aren't going back to the host countries to cause more disruption more destabilization of fragile democracies, more migration. So those are the benefits of the work that is happening, but it also gives space for public health efforts in this country to take roots, and investments of which have also been quite historic and unprecedented.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gupta. This was very insightful. I wondered, well, I've got a lot of questions, but I wondered, first of all, are there precursors that come from within the U.S.? And you mentioned particularly machines, the pill crushing machines, and I wondered if some of those are manufactured here.
So there may be minuscule, but majority of the precursors are coming from China, and there's a small amount that come from India from a precursor standpoint. And they're also often dual-use chemicals. But it's the supply that we have to look at content, how much of it's, and how much is what's the pattern of it. As far as the pill pressers and dye molds, these are the kind of things that are used to make pills, but also some herbals, medication, and others. They're usually coming from China, and they can be imported with relatively very little red tape today. And that becomes a problem.
And my second question, I've been a business journalist for a long time, and when you talk about disrupting a profitable industry, the way it usually happens is an innovation versus attacking. Like, it's not like a small company is going to bring down Microsoft, right? It's usually the small company is working on something so cool that it grows bigger than Microsoft. So I know this is a tough question, but are there really any innovations that would disrupt the industry?
So there are works happening to disrupt, for instance, the dark web and that trade, and those continue. So, I mean, I could say that there's really smart people working really hard to ensure that that robustness is being matched from that perspective. In terms of complete innovations, I think first part of that is to understand and map the network and the way supply chain works. And that's exactly what we're engaged in, is to look at the containers, the shipments that happen, the entire supply, just not the precursors and illicit actors, but also the supply. And how are these being ordered? They're being ordered online through the dark web. And there's so many things that can happen in a counterproductive way that are happening right now. Still, it's important to continue that effort, but also as the evolution happens each time, because one of the things that happen as opposed to the Microsoft example is these folks are able to change and adapt very quickly. And for example, as we are working with China on precursors, we're also working with India at the same time to create a U.S.-India first of its kind counter-narcotics relationship. Because if we are successful with China, India could be the next target. So we want to make sure that that's a stop right there. So some of these are just moving 2 steps forward. And so that's the way the innovation is happening, is learning from our lessons of 2019 and working 2 or 3 steps ahead.
Thank
Got
you.
time for 1 or 2 more questions.
Hi, sir. Thanks for your time. I was really interested in you talking about the damage that's done by the opioid crisis and what we've taken as a nation to address it. But it still kills millions of Americans every year. And on the assumption that no one decides today I'm going to overdose on fentanyl, I wonder if I could ask a naive question that hopefully I'm not the only one who has. Can you talk a little bit about the demand signal? What causes this huge demand that's making it such a challenge to stop?
That's a great question. There's generally the following types of folks I want to talk about. One is people who are suffering from substance use disorder or addiction. And I mentioned there's about 36, 37 million Americans like that. And the fact is, as opposed to diabetes or hypertension, that you could go to your doctor, you get a treatment, it's covered by insurance. That treatment infrastructure does not exist in this country for addiction. It just doesn't. And that's one of the reasons that the president wants to make sure. I mean, he said in his State of the Union speech, let's get rid of the barriers that prevent doctors from prescribing treatment. So that's one of the reasons we're working to remove the barriers, expand 6.7% for all substance use. 6.7% is the only amount of Americans that get the treatment that they need. It's got a huge problem with that. We want to get to universal access to treatment. So we're doing a number of things to expand treatment, create an addiction infrastructure. We're like we were with cancer 100 years ago. Highly stigmatized, no treatment system, not enough R&D behind it. And one of the things we want to do is turn it into mainstream so you would not be stigmatized. You can go to your doctor, get treatment, and not worry about. So that's the first category of people. The second category of people would be those who, and I typically use a college person, but it could be anybody, studying for exam, stressed out, wants to go out and get a Xanax pill. And turns out that Xanax was a counterfeit fentanyl pill and dies. 2 out of 5 pills that are available without prescription, not in a pharmacy, are contaminated with fentanyl today. And it's pervasive in the illicit drug supply of in this country. So that's the unsuspected, unwitting, unknowing person. And the third and last part is probably the casual user, somebody who does not suffer from addiction, but may use casually, but has not gone to the disease of addiction. So those are 3 categories, and much less say that tens of millions of Americans today need the help, and that's one area that there's a lot of investment happening and forthcoming, as well as removal of those regulatory barriers and other aspects to get people the help, including telehealth. One of the things that's happened remarkably during the pandemic, we have now have the ability to telehealth and provide that to most rural, most underserved people, which we're going to make permanent. And the last thing I'll also say is the criminal justice side of this, because that's so important here. We have 65 to 80% of people who are incarcerated today in the United States in a jail or prison have at least one diagnosis of substance use disorder. That's like 65%, 2 out of 3 people. So what we're trying to do right now is to figure out how to get treatment behind the walls. Because the other number is that up to 60% of people, when they get released, they die within 1 month of overdose. Or otherwise, there will be a high level of recidivism. So people say this, that we can't incarcerate our way out of the problem, but we have to build systems, an arc of criminal justice reform that first prevents people from being incarcerated for drug use alone, and then gets people the help through drug courts, treatment, and lastly, when they are re-entering society, get them ready so they are actually productive members rather than high and very expensive risk of recidivism.
Let me take one more and then go ahead and then.
Fertig, I'm with Politico. I really wanted to ask you a quick question. You mentioned marijuana. I was wondering what impact the continued illicit marijuana trade has on the opiate trade, if it facilitates it or any impact. And then also the continued legalization in various states, does that have any impact negatively or positively on opioid use in those states?
Let me answer the second one first. I think there was some initial data, so we're continuing to monitor right now the impact of legalization or otherwise use of marijuana, with the impact on both opioid use as well as other aspects that states are experimenting now. There was some initial data from NIH to demonstrate a benefit that has not panned out in the long term. Further analysis of that study beyond the initial period, we are continue seeing it. Now, having said that, the president has been very clear about the medical uses of marijuana. Evidence has been clear about uses in things like chronic pain, epilepsy, and other disorders. In fact, in my past job, I implemented as state health commissioner medical marijuana program in the state of West Virginia. And to the first one, as a relationship to illicit marijuana trade, I think that's much more of a function of the cost and the higher barriers from legal marijuana, and that's been the biggest challenge that we hear about. That it's a cost issue, that the illicit trade continues, but the trafficking of marijuana, especially over the border, has plummeted. It's dropped. So that's one thing that we're seeing a lot less of, is the cross border. But we are seeing both in public lands grow, the illegal grow of that. But most times that we see that it's there is because of cost factors.
Great. Well, this has been extraordinary. I think it's been an education for all of us, and really insightful. And you've been very forthcoming in talking about both the opportunities and the challenges here. I think we've all, appreciate the complexity of the challenge that you've taken on, and the value of having someone like you to take on this very difficult but very important role. So thank you for sharing that with us today.
Thank you for having me, Dean.